Um, so this is John Doxey with William Stout. It's Monday, May 9th, 2022, and we're at William Stout Architectural Bookstore, and this is our first session for the Telegraph Hill Dwellers Oral History Project. Bill, I'd like to start off just asking you to tell me a little bit about what year you were born and where you were raised.
I was born in Omaha, Nebraska, 1941, and we stayed there for a while, and then I moved to South Dakota to stay with my grandparents during the Second World War with my mother, and stayed there till the end of the war. And in the middle of the war, maybe 1942 or so, my grandparents and the whole family picked up and moved from South Dakota to outside of Portland, and they worked there in the war industries, and did that for a while, and it was in, I think, Cornelius, Oregon, which is right outside of Portland. We lived there for a while, and then we ended up, my grandfather got a job to be the postmaster of this small town in the Badlands of South Dakota. So we picked up the whole family and moved back to South Dakota. And I lived there with my grandparents and my mother, and my father was killed in the Second World War in 1944. And then in 1946, my mother remarried Richard Stout. And so it kind of goes from there. He was also from the area that my mother lived in, a small town called Kadoka, South Dakota, which is the entry to the Badlands. And my grandfather was the postmaster there, and also had, this was kind of a tourist town. So all the people going to the Badlands would go through this town to get to the Badlands, and so it was full of motels. So my grandfather had built, had a large house in the edge of the town, and built a small motel, and he had 6 children, and so the children kind of took care of the motel, and we all lived in this large family, or a family house. And then my mother remarried, and then we started moving around a lot, and moved to...
Excuse me for a second, you said your mother remarried. Was this...
The Richard Stout.
Richard Stout, okay,
Richard
right,
Stout,
okay.
Yeah. And so he was, my stepfather was basically a pilot. The main thing he knew how to do was fly airplanes. So when he married my mother and myself, he moved to eastern South Dakota to teach farmers how to fly airplanes, because that was the big thing there. Every little town was having an airport sponsored by the U.S. government. So we moved to a town called Redfield, South Dakota, and we lived on a small little airport, you might call it. And we lived there for several years, and that's, I then started grade school in that town. We had a couple disastrous things happen. We lived at the airport in a trailer house for a year or so, and one day my mother and I and my brother were away from the trailer house, and we came back, and the furnace had exploded and it was on fire, and so it burnt to the ground. And we then moved into this small town, and my father worked in various jobs there, from working as a salesperson, and then also got a job for a vegetable company, large vegetable company, wholesale vegetable, and was a salesman for them in central South Dakota. None of those jobs really worked too well for him because he was really just a flyer, and that's what he wanted to do. We ended up going back to Kadoka to stay with my parents were offered a job in Kadoka to run a grocery store and a meat packing plant. And so we moved back there and had a small house, and it went pretty well. My mother worked there for a while, and they were good friends of my parents, and but it really wasn't what my father wanted to do. So in 1953, I was probably in the 3rd or 4th grade. My father decided to apply to become a pilot with American Airlines, and he was accepted. And so we got in our car and we were on our way to, let's say, I think it was Fort Worth, is where American Airlines had their training facility. And as we got in the middle of the trip, we were in Kansas, and my father got a telegram from the U.S. government because he was in the reserves that he had been recalled into the Air Force. And so we rescheduled our trip to go from Fort Worth to San Antonio, where he would be trained to fly the B-29s. So we got to San Antonio in 1953 or so, and spent 6 to 8 months there, and went to Topeka, Kansas, where he got, I think he got a crew there, and the crew was 9 people. So we got the crew, and his first station was Mountain Home, Idaho. So we went from, my family went to Mountain Home, Idaho, and I went back to finish a school in South Dakota. So I finished the years there, and then ended up going to Idaho. My grandmother put me on a bus in South Dakota, and I took the bus to Idaho through Utah. And so we got to Mountain Home, Idaho, thinking it was in the mountains, not realizing it was actually desert. And so there was this air base in Mountain Home, Idaho, but there was no housing available in the town. So we moved to Boise, Idaho. And Boise was a town at that time, probably 60 to 80,000. And they had very good schools. And we found a very nice place to live in an apartment village up in the Boise Hills. And to us, Boise was really a very urban situation for us. And the schools were traditional urban schools, concrete Victorian schools, and the teaching was very good. They had a very good educational system at that time. And so we were in Boise for 2.5 years, and then the parents bought a house in Mountain Home. So we moved to Mountain Home when I was 7th grade. So we got to Mountain Home, and Mountain Home is not much of a town or city at all. It's basically a main street with the railroad going through it, and a park that was always given by the railroad to the city, and then 2 or 3 blocks of bars. And that was about it because of the Air Force Base. And we lived on the outside of town, and I ended up going to school there from the 7th grade to high school, finished high school there.
In Mountain Home.
In Mountain Home. And it was a very good, I would say, technical education, but not a very good artistic education. They only had French and Spanish and no art, and the closest thing to drawing or architecture was really mechanical drawing. So I took those courses, and I did pretty well. And their sports were good there. We had good sports teams, and it was a nice place to grow up, but not a very good place to live. It was just it was interesting culturally. I guess I would say it was not a nice place to live, but culturally it was interesting. Because the Air Force was there, it had a lot of different cultures involved in the Air Force. So you would go to school and there would be ballet dancers, and there would be artists that didn't have school training or anything like that. And then there was also, that was the end of the Basque communities that started in California, and it ended up there. So there was a whole Basque community there, a large Basque community in Mountain Home. Sheep herders.
Mm-hmm.
So we were there from the 7th grade to the 12th grade, and there was a Basque community, Air Force community, and a large Mormon community. So in a town of 20,000, it had quite a bit of diversity. And so when I graduated from high school, my father had been in Guam for 2 or 3 years. He was flying, he had flown B-29s in Korea, and then when we got to he went to Korea and then came back, and then he started flying B-47s. And when he started to fly B-47s, when I was a senior in high school, they moved to Moses Lake, Washington. So we went from one desert to the other desert, to another desert in central Washington.
Had you finished high school?
I had just finished high school. My father came back when I graduated, and then went back to Guam. And then that summer we moved to Moses Lake, and then I went to the University of Idaho in the architecture department, 1960. Seemed like a logical place to go. I really was maybe thinking of going to the University of Washington, but with my father gone and my mother kind of helping out, I think they felt Seattle was a little too large. So I ended up going to the University of Washington, or University of Idaho, and it actually worked out very well. I really wasn't, I probably should have taken a year off. I really wasn't into school that much. The architecture program was an interesting program because it was a program integrated with art and architecture. So the first year you took mostly art program, the art drawings, sculpture, painting, and a little architecture, maybe architectural history. And so I did that for a couple of years, I was doing okay. I could always get by. I was good because I'd moved so much, I could figure out how to manipulate situations.
Did you have teachers, professors who were inspiring?
I wouldn't say in Idaho I had too many professors that were inspiring. So I went, the junior year I was there, I had a really nice teacher, and he was quite good. And I had decided that I kind of wanted to figure out how to get out of school as fast as possible. So in my junior year, I'd figured out that if you took summer courses, you could get basically the same amount of credits as if you took a regular semester. So my junior year, I ended up taking a summer course, and it ended up being a very, very interesting and very good, and almost a one-to-one relationship with the professors. There was only maybe 6 to 10 of us in the program, and it was junior, senior, and thesis programs in architecture. And the dean of the department was there, and then you had an architectural teacher that taught studio. And the dean of the department taught art. so we were able to take art and architecture studios.
Lots of overlap then between the art and
It was in the same building, so the architectural studio was right next to the painting studio. And it worked out quite well. The director of the program basically was really good at teaching art. So he actually gave you all the traditional methods of clean brushes, painting, and the whole work. So it was a very nice program. The architecture program was very good because there were a lot of young men that had come back to school from the GI Bill, and so a lot of them wanted to get out too and start making money. And our architecture teacher also played golf. So those I did this for 2 summers, so I got out of school in 4 years in a 5-year program. So the 2 summers, we played golf with the architecture teacher in the afternoon, and then did studios in the morning and painted in the evening.
It sounds like a nice life.
So we got, and it was very good. I never really thought much, I really never thought much of the program, but the basics were taught very well.
This was all University of Idaho?
The University of Idaho. So as I was graduating the 1964 or 5, I went to the dean to kind of find out what he thought where I should probably go to practice and what I should do. And he suggested that probably I should get out of Idaho and maybe get a more rounded education and try to work for 2 or 3 different offices in different sizes. So you could work for a small office, a medium-sized office, and a large office to see what you might be oriented in and how you could develop your career. So I got in my car and went to the East Coast and stopped in the Midwest to see my grandparents, and then drove through Minneapolis, and then drove all the way through to and got a job in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. First, because I had a friend whose father was a surveyor there, and I got a job, and it wasn't much of a job, but the guy, it was an architect that did black churches, which was real interesting because we did that. So I did that for a summer, and it was real nice. He was very nice. He gave me a lot of responsibility.
Were you working as an architect, a designer?
As a designer, an architect. I did that for a summer, and then I decided that Harrisburg was not the place I wanted to stay. I had a very nice place to stay, but I was just getting into the East Coast phenomenon in an easy way. So I then picked up and went, and everything was happening at Yale at the time. So I ended up going to Connecticut to work there, and I got a job in Farmington and Hartford, Connecticut, and lived there and worked for a company called Stecker and Colavecchio. And that was a young firm, and they basically were really busy. And there was only 3 people there, 2 partners and 3 other people, and you got to do the whole thing. And they didn't have many designers, so I was able to kind of fit in, and we had schools, churches, and a few houses, but most of the work was commercial, and it was along the Connecticut coast or central Connecticut, and some work in the outskirts of Hartford. And so I lived in Hartford for a while, and then after about 3 years I decided that the East Coast really wasn't where I wanted to stay because it's so inbred, and so it's kind of like a caste system. If you're not in the system and you haven't lived, it's like going to Maine. If you haven't lived there for 200 years, you're a neophyte, you know.
That
So
sounds like a good opportunity, though, in that firm.
It was
being so small.
It was very good. I could have become a partner there in a year or two and set up for life.
But for a young architect to be able to do everything.
It was a good experience because you had. I did 3 or 4 schools and did a couple churches and housing for the Catholic Church and so on. And it was also close to Yale because Yale was it was very active at that time. And really, I wanted to go back to graduate school, but there weren't any schools, private, other than private schools in Connecticut. They don't have an architectural program in their university system. So Charles Moore had just come to Yale, and so I called Charles Moore and asked him if I could get an interview to see if it'd be possible to get into Yale. And showed him my portfolio, and he said, well, and he was very upfront. He said, well, we have 27 available spots in the program, and there's 450 people applying, and you're from Idaho. He says, I don't think under the circumstances you can have much of a chance. And he was very clear about that. And it was nice he said that. So I hung around Connecticut for another 6 months and got in my car and then came back here.
Before we go on to moving to California, I wanted to just circle back and cover a little ground that we passed over. So forgive my ignorance, but when finishing an architecture program like you did, an undergraduate program, what is the licensing process?
The licensing process is basically you graduate from a 5-year program and you have to apprentice for 3 years. I was very lucky after graduating from the University of Idaho. It was Vietnam War and everybody was getting drafted. I was very lucky where I grew up in this town of Mountain Home. I had a very good reputation, and so I went to the draft board and told them that I was going to apprentice in architecture, and so that gave me a deferment, which is kind of a strange way. It seems kind of strange because my father was in the Air Force, but I didn't really want anything to do with the Air Force. So the kind of the military lifestyle really didn't fit in. Well, a lot of my friends at that time were really into military careers, and it was nothing I was really interested in. So I got a deferment, and then that gave me and then I went back to Connecticut and worked for 3 years. And then at that point in time, you can take the license.
So you'd had enough experience working at the Hartford firm.
I had enough experience there, but I didn't take the license till I got back to California. So I got back to California. I drove back through the country again, which was a nice thing. I went through the southern part, came up through Texas, and came up that way. Tennessee, Texas, Alabama, and all those. And then got into California, and I had a friend in Sacramento. And he had mentioned that he had a friend working for Ernest Kump in Palo Alto, and Ernest Kump had been doing junior colleges and a lot of schools, and he was had a big firm in San Francisco, as much as 100 people at one time, and just quit San Francisco and moved to Palo Alto. So I gave the Kump office a call and interviewed there and got a job. And they were extremely busy. And I lived in Palo Alto and Mountain View. And it was a good time to be in Palo Alto because it's before it kind of got what I call yuppified,
What is the year then that we're talking about?
We're talking probably, I believe it was 67 and 8.
And what the year that you finished Idaho was
64.
And so, okay.
So I spent 3 years in Connecticut, kind of seeing the East Coast, and then came back here. Got this job with Ernest Kump, and they were extremely busy. And
mostly educational buildings?
Mostly colleges, universities. At that time, he had almost 10 schools he was working on at one time in an office that was only had maybe 10 or 15 people. It was really overworked. all over the country.
I believe Cump had an office in New York as well, right?
Not at that time. Not at that time. Cump didn't do working drawings. So what you did is you did the design, and then you did a design development drawing set, and then you gave that to another architect who took it and did the working drawings. But the drawings that Cump did were amazingly well done, so there was no interpretation. You didn't interpret what he did. At that time, we were doing junior colleges. We were working on. I did planetarium at Foothill, and we worked on De Anza, and De Anza was just finishing up. Foothill had been completed, but they put in another building there. And Foothill at that time was considered probably the most advanced junior college in all of America. So he became very famous. So he got projects in Massachusetts. We had 4 projects in Illinois. We had several in like Bermuda and so on.
Can you name some of the specific projects that you mentioned? The planetarium project.
The ones I worked on, or I was trying to think. I think it was the University of the Virgin Islands at a campus that we worked on. One outside of right outside of Amherst, which I don't know. The name of it is not the same now. I think it was called. Can't actually remember. We just went to it 2 or 3 years ago because we were in eastern Massachusetts. There were several in Rockford, Illinois. I don't know the name of them. And then there was one outside of Peoria. And then we also were...
all junior colleges?
All junior colleges at that time, yeah. And...
would you describe him as maybe the foremost designer of junior colleges at that in that period? There were several companies, several firms doing institutional work. Was really big then. The big Midwest company was Perkins and Will, and Perkins and Will was doing most of the work in the Midwest, and Ernest Cump was doing a lot of the work out here in the West Coast. I guess the junior college as a institution was just coming into being, right?
That was brand new.
Post World War II.
So the junior colleges in Massachusetts, that was a new type of building for them. They didn't have anything that was strictly a junior college. After that, then there were other, like Paul Rudolph did some outside of Boston, and we worked with Architects Collaborative on 2 projects, and then I forgot the guy who did. There was one of the partners of Architect Collaborative. We did 2 buildings with 2 campuses. But these were large. Each one of the campuses might have as many as 20 to 30 buildings involved. So you would do a master plan, and the master plan was completed, and then you would start on the buildings that you wanted to work on. Usually the student union and the library and the other. We did the master plan for UC Santa Cruz, and we did a building at UC Santa Cruz, and it wasn't really done very well. So the footings didn't have air circulation, so they actually rotted out.
How would things be divided within the firm? Would you be responsible for an entire building in the campus?
Usually there was one designer for each campus. And then he had a team of people, and a team of people floated around, depending upon the time constraints and the deadlines. So once a deadline came in, usually everybody went to work on that project, got it done, and then you would go to the next one, just kind of putting out fires. And
can I ask you a question? When you finished your undergraduate program at Idaho, was there an idea that you had in mind of what you wanted to do as an architect, the kind of work that you wanted to do, and how did that evolve over the course of time?
I didn't really have a real direction. I was the dean of the school that I met with before I left. He said basically, what you should do, it's more about the type of office you want to be in and the type of office you want, as opposed to, I think where he was wrong there is the fact that you probably should direct yourself in terms of the type of work you want to do, because there's so many variations within the profession. What happened with the schools were really, if I'd have stayed if I'd have stayed with Ernie Kump for long, I'd have probably stayed in doing schools. But I stayed with Ernie Kump for, I guess it was close to a year and a half or 2 years, and then I went to a lecture of one of the people at Cal that gave a lecture on Mabeck at Stanford. And so I went to Ernie and asked that I think I would like to go back to graduate school, and I was thinking of going back to Cal. And he said, well, let me call Dean Wheaton. So Dean Wheaton was the head of the whole department at that time. And so he called Dean Wheaton, and Dean Wheaton just said, well, send your resume up and we'll see what we can do. And then I got into Cal. So I don't know if I would have been able to do that without his help.
Was that unusual that somebody would be
I think
entering
that was the
grad
one thing
school with your level of experience? Or?
I think that was the thing. That was kind of the way education was at that time. If you, it's a little different now, but it was kind of like those very East Coast phenomena where it's all political.
Can I go back and ask? You had mentioned earlier that you felt the East Coast wasn't going to work out for you because of the maybe the hierarchy and the traditions there, and that you had been drawn to California for maybe a new horizons. Were there some other things that were drawing you to California as well? I mean,
no, other than San Francisco's size. The size of San Francisco seemed like it was a nice size of a city to work in. Probably if I'd have known everything about San Francisco, I wouldn't have come here to practice architecture, because it's a terrible place to practice. Modern architecture, because they don't care for, modern architecture wasn't very well conceived here. It's interesting, I just got back from Portland, and you can kind of see what a modern city potentially was when it was, when redevelopment came in and they had strong architecture here. There really wasn't a strong architectural tradition in San Francisco to speak of. And
what is the reason for that? Is that a kind of a public resistance to change, or?
Oh, that's one of the things. I think it's also because it got built so fast. After the fire, and they basically used Victorian models as a model for the city. Mitchell Schwarzer picks up on that in the book that I did on the Guide to San Francisco. He has a pretty good take on that. But it's very, San Francisco is very financially very creative, but from a design and aesthetic standpoint, it's very conservative. So you just drive around here and you just don't see very many good buildings. And luckily the city had Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, and Anshin and Allen, and a few really very good architects that had done a lot of work. But it wasn't like, I just got back from Portland, and in Portland, it's like Beluski. You can drive around Portland and see 20 buildings still there that Beluski did that are amazingly beautifully detailed. And all you have to do is drive around, and they're Beluski buildings. They're Beluski buildings. And I wish I'd have had a little more time to spend this time and do it. But in San Francisco, other than Skidmore doing mid-rise and high-rises in the 60s and 70s, you can't actually do that very much. Most of the creative work that I kind of thought was creative was either done by schools, by Mario Chiampi or Escherick or Marquis and Stoller and so on. But it wasn't really, there really wasn't, there really weren't the juices here to make things work like Los Angeles. Los Angeles has a different kind of economic adventurous, you know, in the movie industry and everything was, you have people who are really not afraid to lose their money, where you have very conservative conservative ethics. A lot of money, but you know. And
so, I mean, a lot of people in the 1960s, in the period in which you moved to the Bay Area, came for lifestyle reasons or because they felt there was some kind of freedom happening.
Yeah.
Now, but you came, it sounds, more for professional reasons.
I did, but that's what was happening. It was, I got to San Francisco Bay Area in '67, '8, and lived in Palo Alto for a while. And living in Palo Alto was like living. I thought it'd be close enough to San Francisco, but it's a big trip up here, you know. So you don't really use San Francisco. So then I went to school in Berkeley, when the riots were on. So that was '68.
The Vietnam riots.
War riots. It wasn't Vietnam. It was.
Or People's Park, perhaps.
People's Park riots. Yeah. The whole campus was blown away. So that was really an interesting experience because I went back to Berkeley not to really study architecture, but to get a degree, but actually to take a break, and took most of my courses in painting in the art department, and you only had to take, I think, 9 units of architecture, which was great. So, and then at the end there was riots, so we didn't even have finals. I mean, finals were just going in and checking in and saying hello and getting out of town, you know, that was it. And so then I went out looking for a job. The school at that time, too, was not really into a design program. It's the first year Christopher Alexander was teaching there, and he was setting up his little school within a school. And they were actually teaching systems analysis and trying to figure out if systems analysis and prefabrication of buildings and everything that could work, which was just and they were also working with Stanford. Stanford was doing a lot of that, and Stanford had a very good program where they did some of these prefabricated building systems and so on. And so there were a lot of people in the school that weren't really architects that were looking at how architecture should maybe be studied. But design in the architecture department at that time was not one of the priorities. So that was fine for me because I spent a lot of time in the art school.
So I think from early on you said in Idaho there was a lot of back and forth between art and architecture. And has painting or sketching been something you've been doing all along through these years?
I never really kept a sketchbook. In Idaho, they said that was a major thing you had to do, that you always kept your sketchbook with you. I didn't do that. I never really started thinking about. I have now. I do the sketchbooks. I do sketchbooks. I have a complete series of sketchbooks. I do the whole year. I've done that, but I didn't really start doing sketchbooks until maybe the '70s. Until I started the bookstore. When I was traveling a lot and buying books and going to Europe and so on. Then I started keeping sketchbooks and doing my art in my sketchbooks rather than painting, because I really, when I got out of graduate school, I actually had lived up in Buena Vista Park for a while and had a studio on Pier 33 with a couple older architects. And
a painting studio.
A painting studio. I had a painting studio in there in Pier 33 up above, which is, the piers are run by, I don't know what it is. But it's a completely different system for the city. And at that time, they didn't even know what they owned, let alone picking up rent. So the rents were cheap, and they were really nice spaces. And we were above the Pier Inn, which was at Pier 33. There's still a restaurant there. And so we had the upstairs area. So I painted there for, I guess, 6 to 8 months. And then...
were you painting, what sort of things, subjects?
Abstract paintings. Yeah, when I grew up in Idaho in high school, the library there always got the New York Times the week afterwards. So it would come in and that was always there. So I read the New York Times all through high school, and so I was very aware of the art scene in New York, even though we didn't have an art program. So I was into what was happening in New York. So really what happened when I got out of school, I went back East Coast, but I went back for the World's Fair is really what the reason I went back. And then, so I went to the World's Fair and then spent time in New York studying, looking at art and going to art museums and probably thinking that New York would be the best place to be, but thinking if I had trouble in New England trying to get work, it'd probably be harder in New York. So I focused on San Francisco because I felt like it was probably the most logical place for me to be in a city that I hadn't been in and was interested in. When I was in high school and college, I used to drive to Portland to buy clothes and things and shop because Portland was just a really a mecca for me anyway.
So the nearest big city.
Yeah, it was the nearest big city. Seattle I never really got into as much, but Portland I did because it was focused and had a little more sense of urbanism. And so going back this last week was good because I was able to kind of spend a little time thinking about that. But anyway, after the art studios, then I got a job with Warren Callister.
Can I interrupt you just for a
Sure.
second? It's interesting when you mentioned that in high school you were going to the library and reading the New York Times and following the art world in other cities, in New York in particular. I mean, what was it? Was there something in you innately, do you think? Or perhaps it was something you were exposed to when you were young or through your parents that began to build an interest in art and architecture? Where does that come from?
I don't know. There's no art in the family history.
Brothers or sisters?
No. And it was a little difficult because my parents had no idea when I went to architecture school what I was doing. And in some ways, that's probably what a young person wants because then you have your own freedom. But in other ways, there was really little interest in what I was doing. And as long as I stayed out of trouble, that was okay with them. My parents were really young, so when I was growing up with them, my mother was more like my sister, and my father I wasn't too close to because he was gone most of the time, and he also had crews that he had. And the B-29 crew was 9 young people, going from people that had master's degrees to kids that just got out of high school and was gunners in the back, So when my father was home, we might in the middle of the night get a call from the police station saying one of his crew was thrown in jail or something, and he had to bail them out. He never really did that. He never I kind of played into the game of not being too much of a problem. And so I got out of town, and then when I went to college, and I did have an interest in art. Art was interesting in New York. You know, it was at the time when New York was taking over from Paris, and the abstract expressionist movement was one of the most important movements in American art history. So I followed that, and then when I went to New York, it really gave me a lot of energy. And being in Connecticut when I moved back there after school gave me the allowance to go. I was in between Boston and New York, so I could go to the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. The Corbusier building was just finishing, and Harvard at that time actually had some decent shows, but now they just keep them in the basement, you know. It's like, and the Boston Architectural Center at that time was kind of interesting because they had some good shows, and was kind of not in the grain of the Ivy League schools. And New Haven was kind of the lifeblood. New Haven, with all the buildings that were going on there, I could go there every weekend, and there were buildings by Philip Johnson. There were 4 or 5 buildings being done by Rudolph. All the local architects were doing buildings. New Haven was really an interesting kind of outlet for me to go on weekends, and I'd go to there and then drop by New York, and then I'd would end up going down to Washington and Philadelphia. So it was a good way for me for 3 years to get a little idea of what living on the East Coast would be like. And I like the idea of the way it's set up, because it's the houses and everything were really quite beautiful and serene and everything. But then when I realized that, I lived in Hartford for a while, and I realized that that the Italians were thought of as being poor paupers, and the Irish were. It was really a caste system, you know, and the Jewish couldn't get into the country club, so the Jewish start their own country club, and it becomes more elitist than the WASPy country clubs. So it was interesting, because when I grew up in Idaho, we had only one black guy on the team, our basketball team, and he was an amazing young man from Vallejo. And I didn't realize it at the time, but he must have had a very difficult time growing up there, because their family could always kind of lived on the other side of the tracks, you know, and they were in the Air Force. And so when I got out of Idaho, then I got back to the East Coast, and it was kind of an eye-opening experience to see how the cities were integrated in different ways, and how often some of the cultures were looked down on that we had never grown up with. Growing up in Mountain Home, it was nice because the Basque people were really interesting people. Some of my best friends were Basque young men.
So was part of the reason to move to California to move away from that into a...
You mean from the East Coast?
Yeah, where that caste system was so entrenched.
Yeah, well, that's what's interesting about the West Coast when you think about it. You don't really realize how open and free it is here. There's a lot of different... You can culturally look at it and kind of put things in places and not be too excited about it, but the freedom is unbelievably more open here than it is there. You can't even go to the beaches on the East Coast. I mean, you own the beach. And so going to the beaches on the East Coast, you have to park in a town, you have to have a parking permit, and you get 2 hours. Other than Rhode Island. Rhode Island, you go to like Misquamicut or beaches there, and they have public beaches. The public beaches in New England really aren't public. They're owned by the towns, you know. And so I moved back here more for lifestyle. Then living there would have been fine if I'd have been married to someone who lived there and had a was inbred. But where I was coming from, it wasn't a good place to be. So coming to San Francisco was a good place for me, and I like being around Berkeley. Stanford, I could never really understand Stanford. So I kind of got out of Palo Alto quickly. And so I've been here ever since. I did...
After finishing Berkeley's program, you've been a resident of San Francisco ever since, is that right?
Well, I got a job with Warren Callister, and Warren Callister hired me. He was doing a large project in Southbury, Connecticut, called Heritage Village, and Howard Backen and a lot of Backen, Argoni, and Ross had all worked for Callister, and they kind of done the master plan. And so Warren needed somebody to go back there to kind of dial for dollars, in reality is what it was. So, and this used to be I was trying to think, the great pianist's house, great pianist. It was a large estate outside of New Haven, Victor Borga. It was a Victor Borga estate. So I went back there probably for maybe a year, and we lived in the Victor Borga house because that was the community building for this town. This was 2,500 units in the middle of Connecticut Street, right next to Waterbury, Connecticut, which is pretty Italian. And our developers were named Paparazzo. So when we were in Paparazzo's office, so Warren didn't really have an office there, but we worked in Paparazzo's office, and we were just kind of extensions of the developer in a way. And it was an interesting experience because they were doing a large town and everything out there. They'd taken over this little town and just built a shopping center and gas station and housing units for, I guess it was kind of a retirement village, but not the level where you had hospitalization and everything taken care of. And they had a beautiful golf course there. And it was a good experience. So I worked there for a while. And then, and in fact, one of the times I went back there with Warren, we had gotten on a plane in San Francisco, and we got off at Kennedy and turned on the radio in the car, and the Art and Architecture building was burning at in New Haven. And so I didn't think Warren would really be into it at all. But we got in the car. He drove directly to New Haven, and they were just bailing out all of the large rope curtains that Rudolph had put in there, and they were all out in the street, kind of smoldering and everything, and the building looked really nasty. And so then we went over to our project, and then they redid the architecture building after that. And the reason basically is the fires. The art students started it, of course, because they were put in the basement, and there was kind of a rebellion.
They were put in what?
They were put in the basement, mm-hmm. where the architecture department had the top floor with their guest lecturers, having an apartment up there when they could come in. So it was really a rebellion. But being in New Haven was really interesting. Kahn had just finished his life. He was just finishing and died with the British Museum, and you had the museum, the art museum that he did, and it was good. Art was really good right then. So there were a lot of little museums you could go to in Connecticut, and then you could go to New York and Boston both. And then a lot of the University of Massachusetts had a big building program, and so in Amherst and their campus there was really growing, and there were a lot of buildings by Kevin Roach and Dinkaloo, and Kevin Roach and Dinkaloo then office was outside, was in Hartford. Well, not Hartford, but the city next door.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, following completion of the program in the grad school in Berkeley, you went and you lived again in the East Coast to work.
I went back. He hired me because I'd lived there, so I went back to Connecticut for another year or so to work on that building, and left, and then came back here, and then decided to start my own office.
Okay, and that's when you moved back to San Francisco.
Moved back to San Francisco.
And you began your own firm? What happened at that point?
Not at that time. I worked with, I came back here, I was a little premature there. I came back here and I got, actually that's when I was doing my painting studio. So I was a little out of sequence there. I was doing paintings at Pier 33, and I was there for a while, and my friend Peter Van Dyne, that I went to Berkeley with, had gotten a job with Halprin, and he was kind of working at Halprin's office. And one of our friends was working out at Ian McKinley's office, so I got a job with Ian McKinley in Orinda, and we worked there for a while. And Ian McKinley's office was a very interesting experience because you kind of ran your own job there, and Ian didn't really care. Ian just let you go. And there were really interesting people, so I met my eventual partner Jim Jennings there, and there were really wonderful people working there. The work we were doing wasn't that great. There was a lot of work up at Lake Tahoe, kind of mountain houses and stuff like that. And then we got a job to do a project in Orinda called Orinda Woods, and it was really interesting because the developer was the guy who did the Coliseum, Bob Nayhouse, and then another money person from Contra Costa County.
Which Coliseum?
The Oakland Coliseum.
Oh, the sporting complex.
The sporting complex. And Bob Nayhouse was responsible for Bart going out there. He was really an interesting man. So he and his partners bought this piece of property called Kite Hill in Orinda. It was basically a hill that had been overrun by locals because it was their public park, but it wasn't public. So the project was to take this hill and to put housing up there, and we did that. And there were housing and recreational facilities. It was an interesting project because it was really moved a lot of earth and stuff to make it work. And
Is it called Kite Hill, the project?
It's called Orinda Woods now.
Orinda Woods.
Orinda Woods. So the interesting part about it, it was individual housing units that you didn't have any and individual architects could do. And then there were condominiums that were done, and then there were recreational buildings. And so I was in charge of doing a lot of the recreational buildings and the landscaping. It was really a big landscaping job. Mm-hmm. They moved over 1.5 million yards of earth to make this thing work. But it was interesting. It's now considered, at that time it was really avant-garde in terms of what we were doing, and nobody really liked it, but it's now considered kind of a very nice place to live.
Was Halprin involved at all with that?
No, Halprin was doing, in fact, this weekend I saw 3 of Halprin's fountains up in Portland, but Halprin was doing work all over the world at that time. We had a landscape architect that's just down the street here, very interesting man, and I think his idea of landscaping was just throwing seeds out, letting things grow naturally, and that's basically what happened. We had an interesting experience there because we did, along with other young men in the office, they did a couple of complexes that were courtyards that were developed really beautifully with the units looking out over the various parts of the hill, and a lot of them looking out to the freeway. And as opposed to what most people think, the freeway units were the first to go. People liked the action of the freeway. the motion and so on.
This was over Highway 24, I suppose.
Yeah, the big freeway out there. So it was like it was a little hard to figure why they would do that, but those were the first units to sell, so it was real interesting. But that was good. So then I then worked. They had a slow period, so then I got a job with Sandy Babcock on Union Street, and they did housing similar. They were involved with a lot of stuff in the valley. So I did several projects with them for a couple of years with a big developer in Stockton. And working out there was interesting because of the water. You really have, the units were usually put on podiums up above the water so that if it ever flooded, they wouldn't get flooded. Those were fun projects too. Both of these developers, Ian McKinley Architects, Ian McKinley and Sandy Babcock, kind of just let you do your own projects. And as long as you didn't create issues, it was fine.
You mean that the firm found the contract, but then you were able to
do your own design? You
worked
within the firm and you did the whole design, and as long as the client was happy, everything worked pretty well. So I worked there for a while, and then eventually got together with Jim Jennings and a couple other people, and we started our own office.
In San Francisco?
We started basically in Berkeley and ended up in San Francisco. We had an office on Union Street. It was it's where the little bookstore, the bookstore that just moved? Boy, it's amazing. They just took over the bakery, Pino.
I do know about that.
Yeah, well, we were in that space.
Really?
Well, we were in his space on Jasper Alley. So we were in Jasper Alley for 4 or 5 years.
And approximately what years are we talking about then?
I'm trying to think. 74 to 81, approximately. And then I started the bookstore in 74. So when
we're going to talk about the bookstore in a few minutes, but I recall that in the earliest days of your bookstore, you were doing it from home, really, right?
It was. I had an apartment at 1218 Montgomery, which is the Bella House, and so the bookstore started it there. Yeah.
And initially you were open only during the lunch period and on Saturdays, right?
Yeah.
And that's because you were doing your own work at the time. Is that right?
I was actually doing my own work and also working. I got a nice job with Whistler Pottery. They were doing some work, and it was nice working there because you could just do work at your own hours. And so you just set up your own meetings and everything worked well. So I would go to work in the morning at 8 o'clock and work till 10:30, come back and open the bookstore at 11 and work till 2, and then go back and work at Whistler Pottery. And so that was interesting. I was very lucky to get that job. So I was able to, I had 3 or 4 houses down in San Jose I was working on. And so that worked out pretty well.
Throughout these years that you're living and working in Berkeley and San Francisco and other, maybe even when you're on the East Coast, are you beginning to build a collection of books?
Well, I started collecting books when I was at Idaho. There was a great bookseller in New York called George Wittenborn. And George advertised occasionally in the New York Times, but also did a catalog. And so I would buy, I didn't have much money at the time, so I bought a few books from him through the catalog. And then when I went to New York in '64, I made a special point to go to his bookstore on Madison Avenue above in the second floor. And it was that was pretty inspiring. He was really an interesting man, and had a great collection. So one of my first books I bought there when I was in Idaho was a Besher and Besher book on anonymous architecture, signed by Mrs. Besher. Yeah, but so I still have that book. I still have it.
By the time we're getting to, you know,
I probably have to stop about 12. Is that okay?
That's fine. But around this time, let's say by the late 60s, early 70s, you'd been out of, well, let's say by early 70s, was your collection rather large? And
no.
When you moved from place to place, was it, where did you bring your books? Did you carry them from place to place or keep them stored?
I got married in the early 70s, and I got divorced in 2 or 3 years, but I had collected a lot of books. And I actually had a little office over on Green Street where I lived. I forgot about that. And I didn't have a lot of books, but I had interesting books. And then in the early mid-70s, then I'd go to Europe quite often. I went to Europe 2 or 3 times and then brought home a lot of books. And so that bringing home those books was, and my own library was what set up the bookstore.
I think maybe this is a good place for us to break away because it's getting to be close to 12.
Sure.
And I think we'll have to pick it up again another time if that's okay with you.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine.
All right. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, Bill. We're resuming our interview. Today is May 16th, 2022. This is John Doxey from the Telegraph Hill Dwellers Oral History Project with William Stout in his bookstore on Montgomery Street. May 16th, 2022. And this is our second session together. Last time as we were finishing up, we brought it right up to about the time that you were beginning the kind of nascent bookstore. I think you were collecting books, right? And living in the Belli building. I believe you had a roommate, right?
Yeah, so that was in 1974 when the bookstore started. My roommate was, I needed a roommate at that time because I didn't have, couldn't afford the space, so Stephen Hall, the architect, was my roommate for a while, and he helped work at the bookstore when I first started, one of my first employees. And then after 6 or 7 months, he took off and went to AA in London, and then I was living there and working the bookshop alone. So I was at 1218 Montgomery for probably approximately 3 or 4 years.
Excuse me for a second. Had you been there before? Did you mention in our last session that you had been married?
No, yeah, I had been married, and I went to Europe and bought a lot of books at that time. And when I came back, I went to a lecture of Stephen Hall, and he had given a lecture on Louis Kahn, and he had just been to the office. He was interviewing there for a job. And when I got back, we both needed an apartment, so we found this apartment on Telegraph Hill, and it happened to be in the Melvin Belli house. And it was a nice apartment, 2-bedroom apartment, and basically I started the bookstore in the living room of the apartment with the books that I brought back, and then a few books that I published, or that I bought along the way. And at that time we were open from 11 to 2 during the week, and then on I think it was 12 to 5 on Saturdays.
And this is because you were juggling two things, right? You were also working at this time.
Well, no, it was more like there were a lot of architects in the area, maybe 100 to 200 architectural offices in the area, and they would come up at lunch. So it seemed like just to keep the bookstore, or to start the bookstore in a lunch scenario. And that worked pretty well. So offices would come up either in single or in groups, and then they would buy books occasionally. And I realized at that time that the bookstore wouldn't survive if I didn't do a catalog, and I kind of used the George Wittenborn catalogs from New York that he would send out from his art bookstore on Madison Avenue. And so I also, as I started the bookstore in 1974, I also did printed catalog. It was very small in the beginning, a one page, and then I sent that out to architects, at that time probably 200 or 300 architects that I thought might buy books. And then when people bought books, I would take their address and then send them catalogs every so often. So the next catalog was a little larger, and it was probably 15 or 20, probably 16 pages, because it could be folded from an 8.5 by 15, and then we'd fold it up and then mail it out in an envelope. And then probably a year or two after the bookstore started, I was introduced to a couple of printers, and one of them was James Munday. He was a young architectural student that also printed books for different people all in the Bay Area, and he usually did letter set printing. But what we decided to do was do regular offset printing for catalog 3 and 4, and do that in offset, and then do a letter set cover. So we'd do a really fine cover, and then on a series of, I think it was probably 32 pages was the catalogs 3, 4, and 5. And they were all done in letter set printing, so they were really quite well done. James worked for Goins, the printer in Berkeley, and used his press, and then we had the offset done by another company. So that seemed to work pretty well, and we started then to do mail order business as well as people in the bookstore.
Excuse me for a second. I'm a little confused because I thought from our previous discussion that when you initiated the bookstore during these limited hours, lunchtime and Saturdays, that you had concurrently been working in an architectural firm.
I had been doing that. So I was working for an architect early in the morning and late in the afternoon, and that was one of the reasons. But I had already established the 11 to 2 format. So I got a job with Whistler Pottery at the time to work on a couple projects they did, and I could work my hours around that. So it was, I think I worked 8 to 10:30, and their office was just down the street. Then I'd come back to the bookstore at 11 and work till 2, and then go to work there at 2:30 or 3.
Were you pretty excited about the prospect of a book
bookstore?
A book selling operation? I mean, was that something that you envisioned at that point as the direction that you wanted to move in?
I didn't really know if it would work or not. I had friends who thought it was really strange, and they didn't quite understand the format of what I was doing. And I'm pretty stubborn, and so I had probably decided it was going to work, and when I decide it's going to work, it's going to work. And I was basically supporting it, so it was just a matter of time before it may develop. After a year or two of doing one of my first big publishers that I got a hold of was Futagawa in Tokyo, and he had just started GA International, which was a large publishing company doing large format books on buildings he had covered all over the world. And then he was doing book called GA Documents, which was documenting certain projects, and then he had GA Houses and GA International, which was, he had done about 24 of the small, large format books.
What did GA stand for?
Global Architecture. So global art, so he had just started this, and he also had a gallery in Tokyo, and he had children at the time, and they ended up being going to architecture school and ended up actually working the business later on. The nice thing of working with Mr. Futagawa was he was not concerned about payment. So as long as he would give me credit up to 4 or 5 months, so I would get the books and I could pay for them anytime I wanted. And that was really a nice venture because cash flow was an issue at that time. So a couple years into the bookstore, then Chuck Bassett and a couple of his friends from Skidmore, Owens and Merrill came up, and they were then frequent visitors to the bookstore.
Was he the director of the office?
He was the principal in charge of the San Francisco office. He came out here to work on the Crown Zellerbach building that I think had been designed by Goldsmith or whatever in Chicago, and he kind of made that work. He was a very interesting man. He was interested in books, so he was basically developing a fairly good library of history and theory at Skidmore, and they had a special room for it, and it was starting to be a pretty good collection. So at that time, he came up with a proposal that he would establish a library committee at Skidmore, and then maybe 4 or 5 people, and they would meet once a month, and I would bring over books, and I could bring over as many as 20 or 30 books, and then they would pick the books they wanted, and then the other ones I would bring back, and then they would pay for the books they bought.
So they became one of your leading customers.
They became a very good customer. There were a lot of other customers. Kaplan McLaughlin was just down the street. They had a librarian. Marquis and Stoller was right down the street. And there were, I would say a good 100 to 200 offices in that area before they kind of got priced out and moved to kind of the interior design section over south of Market. And so when they moved out, then the lawyers moved into Jackson Street, and that kind of changed the format at that time. And there were still a lot of interior people there selling antique furniture and so on, and books. So that worked very well, and about a year into it, I was delivering books to actually I had decided that I was going to have to move because the apartment was on the 3rd floor. Third floor of a building, and it was a wood frame building, and it was getting a little overweight in some places, and the building wasn't in the best of shape. Belli didn't take care of his buildings too well.
And was there an elevator?
No elevator.
So you had to
just stairs.
Carry these boxes of books up and down stairs.
So everything, and we've always had in North Beach, we've always had good mail service, U.S. mail. So the mailman would deliver the books up and so on. And it had a large courtyard. The building itself had a big courtyard with a couple of trees in it that were just amazing. And so that would then shelter the courtyard, and people could come there and park and so on. It was a very nice location. It was at the top of the stairs at Montgomery, just before you got to Union.
Belli was no longer...
Belli never lived there while I was there. He was still in his office down on Montgomery, 600 block of Montgomery, and we'd see him often, but he didn't have any idea what was going on in that building because his wife basically didn't like the building, and they bought a house in Pacific Heights. So he had a manager, and that was fine. We just paid the rent and everything. And then probably in, I'd say 3 or 4 years, we'd been working pretty successfully. The bookstore was then open probably from 1 to 5. And the Skidmore operation was working. And I decided that I probably was going to have to find another space. So,
was this becoming more and more of a full-time proposition for you, I think.
Yes, I was then starting my own practice. I had a few houses, and so I had one of the rooms was a little office that I had. So I had 3 or 4 houses I was working on. So I was actually practicing myself at that time. So I started my own office, and then Steve left after a year or so, and he went to the AA in London, and then I had an office where he was in one of the rooms, and then I was delivering books to Skidmore 2 or 3 years later, about the time I was going to move, and it became, I was walking.
They were located in the Alcoa building?
They were in the Alcoa building, and so I was going back and forth between the Alcoa building and the bookstore, and I went up Osgood, and I happened to find a store there. And they were just moving out of a location on the first floor at 17 Osgood.
Was there a for rent sign?
No, there wasn't a for rent sign. The owner was there, and he was kind of trying to figure out what to do. And so I talked to him and said, I was wondering if he was going to rent it. And he said, possibly. And he said, I forgot what he said. But anyway, I ended up renting it. It was just one floor, a very small space, maybe 12, 13 feet wide and about 50 feet long, with a bedroom in the back, and that just so happened to be where they had done the movie Behind the Green Door. So we
in the bedroom?
In the bedroom in the back, yeah. And it was a kind of a risque alley at that time. There was a lot going on. And so I started the bookstore there, and it was a very nice location. And the building wasn't in great shape. My landlord was Jerry Barish. He was a bail bondsman and a movie maker, avant-garde movie maker. And he had an office down on next to the police station down on Bryant Street. He was fairly good landlord, but he never did anything. So I just...
Did you say that building had been originally constructed as a bordello?
Above on the building next to it had been.
I see.
Yeah. So it was basically kind of a stable with a bordello on the top of 4 rooms that you would walk up to, and that's actually where in the bottom of that space we rented. It was kind of part of my office. I had moved from Montgomery down there, and I rented a space next door, which used to be a stable, and that became an office. And then I hooked up with Peter Van Dyne and Jim Jennings, and we had a small office there for a while. And then there was a little space next door to that, and that's where Susie Colliver and Dan started Arch. So Arch started there. And then the bookstore kept rolling, and I eventually then found there was an apartment above the bookstore at 17 Osgood, and I rented that, and then I started... at that time, it was in Osgood. I didn't really have out-of-print books or rare books, so I worked with Ken Starosiak, who was a bookseller on Sutter Street, and I took some of his out-of-print books on consignment and started selling them, and eventually started my own out-of-print section and moved into the bedroom in the back and made that the rare book room. And then I moved upstairs, and the building, which was unique, one of the unique features of the building is had this beautiful courtyard in the back. And there was a lot of activity going on. There was a restaurant on Broadway, and there was an alley that hooked into the back of the courtyard, and there was a Chinese residential home on the left, and then there was a disco in the back. So there would be music going on all night, and these young children crying and everything. But it was a really nice location, and the garden was very nice. So when guests would come to town, I'd oftentimes have lunches in the garden for them.
Did you have events, bookstore-related events?
Didn't really. The first event we actually had is Steve Hall had been in, after a couple of years, Steve Hall had started to do projects, and he had moved from London back to New York, and he had a show in New York, and we had that show in the bookstore in San Francisco. So we took the whole gallery and made an architectural exhibition.
Let me just.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you. You were saying that you had your first event there was what?
Was a series of pencil drawings that Stephen Hall had done when he went to New York. When Steve and I were in San Francisco, one of the things that was happening is the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies in New York was starting to develop, and they had a lot of events there. And so we would get posters and everything of the events, and they started to publish. They published oppositions and different books, and they had these great institute in New York. So when Steve left, he hooked up with the institute, and he did some projects with them. And the first show we had was some of his projects that he had done, that he had won working with the institute with Andrew McNair in New York. And so and he had also worked on the competition to redesign the Capitol building in Minneapolis. So we had a large model and that was done in San Francisco. So we had a large model of the Minneapolis state building, and then we had his drawings, and they were these wonderful pencil drawings that he had done. And so we filled the whole interior of the bookstore with his drawings.
Nice.
And it was a nice event. So we had that for a couple of months. And then I started collecting posters and graphics, and we would have those up. And also some magazines. We would buy magazines of offices that were going out of business or whatever. So we had a lot of magazines. The bookstore was floor to ceiling books. So I was working at the time. I'd been starting my own office, so I had a manager in the bookstore. At that time, I had a manager and 2 people working the bookstore, and then I took my office from next door on Osgood to a place on Jasper Alley, Jasper and Union. And with Jim Jennings and Peter Van Dyne and I, we started an office over there. So
Your architectural
office there. And
so
we were there for probably 5 years.
To get back to what I was alluding to earlier, while doing the bookstore, you were wearing 2 hats. You had your firm.
Yeah, we had an office that we were just starting, and we were doing pretty well there. So we had the office ended up being probably 5 or 6 people, and we had the bottom floor of a building at Jasper Alley.
And did you live in the apartment that was above the bookstore?
I lived in the apartment above the bookstore. So I had a manager running the bookstore for the 4 or 5 years we were on Osgood. And then I then worked in the office. So I was just there after when they needed me, basically. So, and I would look over everything to make sure everything was done properly. And then we kind of outgrew that space. So we kind of didn't have much room to go. So it was either me trying to buy the building or figure out another space. The problem is that this is when all the Chinese money was coming into San Francisco, and there was an old warehouse across the street on Osgood, and a developer bought it and put up a big building there, so it blocked all the sun into the building. So the building kind of went to the south for me. I didn't feel much interest in it. Plus, it didn't have any parking. So in 1983 and 4, I started looking for spaces, and I had been in Osgood for about 5 or 6 years, I guess, maybe more. And so I ended up finding 804 Montgomery Street, which had been empty for a small amount of time, and it had 1,300 square feet in a basement and 1,300 square feet above, which was more space than I needed. But I decided to take the space and then live in the basement and run my small office over there. And so I had a small office in the basement, and I lived in the office, and I lived downstairs in the basement.
On Jasper Alley?
No, this was basically in 804 Montgomery.
where we are right now.
Where we are right now. So that was 1984. And about that time, the office broke up. My office with Jim Jennings broke up. We had had a lot of work, but it got to the point where it was really slow, so we just decided to part our ways. So in 84, then I moved my part of the office to 804 Montgomery Street, and then I lived in this basement, and it was a fairly nice, it was plenty of space, and then we had the bookstores on the first floor. And so that went for, and that was, then we were doing catalogs about every 3 or 4 months we would come out with a catalog, and the catalogs got very big. They were sometimes as many as 500 or 600 titles, and we would send those out mass mail. And they started out as being a catalog that would fit maybe 2.5 by 5 or so that would fit into an envelope, and then we would send those out. Then we got to the point where the catalog got a little bigger, and we could do them with a larger press, and we would then have a mailing service sending them out. And we got to the point where we were doing as many as 20,000 catalogs. And probably around 84 to 90, then at that point in time we had as many as 100 to 200 library accounts, and they would buy from those catalogs.
What is your current catalog? Is it still around 20,000?
We basically just do an email, and the email is between 15 and 20,000, yeah. But so the catalog then became a real vital part of the bookstore, and but there were a lot of tourists too. And then in '86, we get Amazon. So Amazon starts coming in, and then everybody tries to figure out what's going on with retail. And of course, Bezos didn't even know anything about books, but he started to discount books, not knowing anything about them, and he was selling books at wholesale prices, and it became a real challenge. So most of the libraries then ended up buying, of course, from them because they could buy cheaper. So it was a real tricky phenomena. It was a change, and we had to figure out how to make it work. And we never really got back to the point where we were as busy as we were before Amazon, but it got to a point where we were actually managed a little better, and we were able to control our inventory a little better.
Well, I do want to discuss that with you, because the bookstore business has changed so much. I mean, and at the same time you said the architectural firms in the area were moving to other parts of the city, and a different kind of
yeah, at that time, a lot of the offices, what happened is Arch then moved over to Jackson Street. So Susie had an office for her supply store on Jackson Street. And then Jackson Street got so expensive, everybody left. And then lawyers moved in, and then the rents went up. And so everything kind of dispersed. And at that point in time, there were a lot of tourists that were coming in. There were a lot of Japanese and Oriental tourists in the summer. So our July and August were usually busy with tourists, so we had a lot of tourists.
So there was a changing nature of the customer, less these people from nearby architectural firms coming in to browse for their own
and they were
professional purposes, and more of tourists coming in.
Well, and they're basically, it was a new phenomena for them, and they could buy books cheaper on Amazon. It took a while to adjust before we got a lot of those clients back in the office or back in our bookstore. And so it was important for us to try to find books that Amazon may not have. So we had a lot of Italian, German, and Dutch and English books that we would import. And you wouldn't find those at that point in time on Amazon. The problem that the American culture had at that time is we should have done a situation similar to they did in France and Germany, where new books couldn't be discounted for the first 2 years, and then it would allow bookstores to keep in existence. But what happened with Amazon is it basically wiped out the small bookstore market because you couldn't compete with them. So we had our own niche, and it worked for a while. And it's been working for a while, but it's not quite the business it was before Amazon. And we've just found our own niche, and we also have collected more out-of-print books. So we found that we can also sell the out-of-print books and do quite well with them when I buy libraries.
There's things, so in other words, it's in a lot of bookstores, I think people go in, they enjoy browsing, and then they go buy the book on Amazon. But in your case, the books aren't available on Amazon.
Yeah, the new books, at that point in time, then a lot of the books would not have been available on Amazon, or the client didn't have the energy to find it. If we can get people into the bookstore, we can usually even sell them books that might even be on Amazon.
Are there other, not Amazon per se, but other maybe niche online retailers that would be competitors for you that do specialize in architectural books?
There used to be a bookstore, the Urban Book Center in New York, was run by the Architectural League, and they were supported by, it was a non-profit, and they couldn't make it work there, so it went under. There was Jaap Rietman in New York, was an art and architecture bookstore. He went under. In Chicago, there was Prairie Avenue Bookstore, and they eventually went under. There was a bookstore in Houston for a while that was going to try to take all of Futagawa's titles and market them, and Futagawa got to the point where he needed money, and so when the guy couldn't pay his bills, and he actually went under. He did the reason this was interesting in the books business is that the person in Texas basically decided that he would pre-sell books that Futagawa was doing, and he would pre-sell them at a discounted price if you bought them beforehand, so that he would get the cash. But what happened is the price of the books went up, and he'd already been paid for the books, so he really took a loss on those, and that didn't work too well. And then in Los Angeles, it's Hennessy and Ingalls, and Hennessy and Ingalls has always been a really good art and architecture bookstore. When I started, they were on Wilshire Avenue in mid-Wilshire, and then they went to the Santa Monica Mall, and then they went up to Pico for a while, and now they're next into Japantown in Los Angeles, next to SciArc.
And they're still going strong?
They're still going. I'm not sure how strong, but they're really big, and I think that it's just hard for them to make it work. But they don't have quite the catalog business that we do. And then in Seattle, there's Peter Miller. He has a nice little shop that deals with architectural equipment and interior finishing type of things. And he combines that, and he's still there. He's moved several times in the last 5 or 10 years, but he seems to be doing quite well. And then there's not too much. So the West Coast is really the only area where there still are architectural bookstores still standing.
Do you also, I read somewhere that your business includes a publishing arm that is focused on up-and-coming architects who
in 1994 I started publishing books. Publishing books maybe of people on the West Coast that wouldn't be covered by the East Coast market, because there probably wouldn't be enough market for them in terms of distribution. So I started doing books. I did a book on some of the first books. I did a Jim Jennings, a book, a small monograph. I did a book on Tanner Liddy. At that time it was Madam and Stacy. We did a book on Thomas Church. We got a situation. I hooked up with the archives in Berkeley, and we did 5 books through a grant from the Getty, where we did 5 books that kind of worked on their archives. One of them was done on Thomas Church. We did one on Noguchi, and there were several other titles that we worked on. And then I did titles outside of that, and overall, I think we did close to 40 or 50 books. The problem we were running into was the fact that there was no place to sell them. So the distribution got down to the point where we were just distributing in museum bookstores and so on, and they were very picky about what they chose. And so eventually it got to the point where I had a lot of books that weren't selling, and so I closed that probably 8 or 10 years ago, and have been. And then about that time, well, let's see, I would say in the 90s, Mark Tribe had or Mark Horton had an office on South Park in San Francisco, and he offered me a location over that to do a bookstore and a small gallery. And so we went to South Park and put in a very nice bookstore, a lineal bookstore, and then there was a gallery, kind of a garage gallery next to it, and we had exhibitions there. We had quite a few exhibitions there, probably 10 or 15, and they worked around Mark Tribe, or Mark Horton would have different people have shows, and then he would have events there and talks, and then we would open up the bookstore. And then the bookstore was pretty well received, and it was a good location. It was just at the time that the new ballpark was energizing that area, and after a few years, Mark's owner Mark didn't have actually a lease on the space, so we actually lost the lease, or didn't lose the lease, but the rent went up so high that we had to move. So we moved out of that space, and in 2000 we found a space in Berkeley on Solano. So we looked around for spaces in Berkeley to maybe have a second store. And so we looked all over, and probably should have probably had a space over by the on Telegraph Avenue,
closer to the university,
close to Oakland. No, close to CCAC. And we couldn't find a space. There were spaces, but they were really pricey. So we ended up going to the middle Solano. We found a very nice space. But the problem is that there's a lot of architects that live in Berkeley, Albany, and El Cerrito, but they work during the day, so they're not there during the day. So that shop worked quite well in terms of what it had as inventory, and it was a good location. The problem were the hours. In other words, the hours, we would have probably been very successful if we were open from, let's say, 4 o'clock to 10 o'clock at night, because that's when everybody was shopping, and that street kind of becomes alive there. And the problem with Solano is it's really not a walking street. It's everybody drives, and they really are pretty ambitious drivers. And so that went pretty well. We had that for 5 or 6 years, and it just wasn't, it was working, but it just was too much of a hassle. So in, I would say, 2002 or 3, I rented a warehouse for my book publishing and my own libraries in Richmond, in a nice warehouse, the beautifully designed warehouse that Jim Jennings did for Oliver Construction Company. And I rented 5,000 feet there. And the space was really well done. And so we had pallet racks, and we could take care of all of my publishing books, and then I had my own libraries over there. And then when...
And excuse me, that's not open to the public, though, right? That's a wholesale.
It's open, but it originally started as being open to the public. We moved all of the inventory from Solano Street to there, and it became a very nice bookstore. But people at that time there was a lot of activity in Richmond, and people would not go to Richmond for any reason at all. And so it never really worked as a retail space, even though it was really quite well done. And we occasionally open it now by appointment, but it basically is just a warehouse for the bookstore here in San Francisco, and then we have to find things.
And for your catalog business, or the
For the catalog, for the email business,
for the email business.
for the email business. We eliminated the hard catalog businesses when we started the email because it was kind of redundant, and it was actually it takes about the same amount of time to do the catalog as doing the email. So we just do right at this point in time we do an email splash every week, and then we get several orders from that. And that kind of builds up the amount of books that we sell.
Do you have other things stored there too, for architectural related, furniture perhaps, or other things?
I have some of my own things. For a while, this space at 804, we decided years ago the space here had a lot of books in it, and we took all those books and moved them to the warehouse for storage. And about that time, Michael Boyd, the furniture collector, rented this space and used this as a warehouse for his beautiful modern furniture collection. And he was here for probably, I'd say 8 or 9 years. And he then moved out of here, and then with me stopping the publishing company, I had space at the warehouse, so he rented space at the warehouse up until last year. And so what I have over at the warehouse is my own personal architectural libraries, along with several thousand books for the bookstore, and then storage area for other things. And up until 2 or 3 months ago, Michael Boyd had all of his furniture there.
And speaking of other locations, you briefly had something, well, I don't know how briefly, but at the California Historical Society.
Oh, yes, I forgot about that. In probably the late 90s, I would say, we were approached by the director of the California Historical Society to see if we could help him with his bookstore. And I basically told him that I didn't think I could help him with the bookstore because we didn't actually work in that genre. But that if he would rent us the space, we'd have a bookstore there and make our own bookstore. So I took it on. It wasn't very well thought out because the problem is that we didn't have our own entry. And with it being a museum and they didn't have an entry of their own, we had to have a guard there all the time if in fact we were open when they weren't, and they weren't open on the weekends. So our Saturdays became quite busy, but yet not too profitable because we had to have people there all the time to make sure somebody wasn't breaking into the California History Museum. Well, we had a really nice shop. I had a good staff. We had 2 or 3 people over there, and it was a good location because it was next to the museum. It just so happened that we decided to close that store about the time they were renovating the new museum, which was good for us because we got out of there. Then we went to Berkeley. So I had, at that time, I actually had 804 Montgomery and California Historical Society, and then I was just in the process of doing the bookstore in Berkeley. So that was, and then the Berkeley location on Solano worked quite well. It just, as I mentioned, it was just the wrong hours, and I was having trouble staffing that store, and nobody wanted to work from 4 to 9 at night. So we closed that store probably 2006, I think, 2007. And then all of that material then went to the warehouse, and that's where it is now.
Up until what time, and maybe you still are actively engaged with design projects. I mean, do you still have an office?
No, I gave up. I worked in this location architecturally for maybe 4 or 5 years, and had a little work, and then I had a show in 1991. There was a show of 4 architects at the Museum of Modern Art: Jim Jennings, Jim Shea, and Tanner Lee, Madam and Stacy, and myself. And we had a show there in 1991, and so I had 5 or 6 people down here putting together that exhibition. And at that time I had a little work, but not a lot of work. And so that went on, and then the show was over in 91, and then I then started to feel like I was probably better to do the bookstore, because I was getting too much activity between the 2 businesses. So I then put my energy into the bookstore and decided to do that. It was I worked with my wife Paulette for a couple of projects, trying to see if we could work some things out, and we had a couple of really nice projects that didn't develop, but that really wasn't a great relationship either, because you didn't need to work all the time with a partner that you're going to live with, so we decided not to do that anymore.
Your wife is an architect?
Yes, she's an architect. She practices in San Francisco, and she does affordable housing.
And what is her name? Paulette?
Paulette Taggart.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's the name of her office.
What year did you marry?
We married in 1986. And she has we have a house on Telegraph Hill on Edith Street. So we live on Edith Street, and so we can actually, her office is on Greenwich Street, down by the pool and the North Beach pool, and then my office was here, so it's very easy to get back and forth. So
I want to get back to the neighborhood in a minute, but I'll just talk a little bit more about the bookstore business. And it seems to me that, I mean, one of the advantages you have over some sort of an online retailer would be the kind of the tactile experience, the sort of beautiful experience of coming into a store like that. Is that, would you say, kind of the secret sauce, or?
Well, I'm more, in the way I run my business, the bookshop, is it's more about the quantity of the material as opposed to the way you display it. I'm not a great, I could probably run the shop with 1/3 of the material that I have now, but I'm more interested in having more material that you can offer to a larger variety of clients, as opposed to just being directed in one direction. So rather than just being a total design bookstore in architecture, we have a history and theory section, and we also include graphics, and we have a small art section, and an interior section. So
how would you describe your core customer?
I would say a lot of the customers, we probably have 50% of our customers are old customers that have come back. We get a lot of customers on the email that are repeat customers from all over the United States. At this point in time, there just isn't anybody really doing some of this material, so we kind of have a lock on it. So if you can get the material to them, they're going to potentially buy from you, even though we don't discount the books and we charge for shipping. But most people are more interested in the material than it is the cost.
But would you describe them as mostly people in the architectural profession?
Most everybody that would order from us are in the design profession, either interior designers, or architectural offices. And we still have a few libraries, but not a lot.
And do a lot of these customers not actually come into the bookstore. They're ordering just from the email.
We have customers never been in a bookstore. Yeah, I mean, we have probably 50 to 100 customers in New York City alone, and a lot in Texas, quite a few in the Midwest, and all of the larger cities that have architectural offices are buy from us.
So I would imagine that a certain number of people, maybe younger people, would come in just to be inspired or looking for insight,
They
browse and.
Yeah, I think that's what the store is basically about. The younger people don't have the money to usually buy the books, so it's an opportunity for them at least to see the material. And I think that's the problem with the internet sales, is that a lot of these people would buy a lot more books if we had more of the information up for them to buy. The problem we have, or the issues that you have with internet sales, is you have a time span on how long you can stay on the internet, and our site isn't the best in terms of using the site. What usually works best for us is the recent books that are coming out, and that you can roll those over. Our site isn't developed too well to go in and really search deeply without a lot of work. About 4 years ago, we went with a new e-commerce site. It's called Shopify, and they give us a good presence on the internet, but they're not very easy to work with, and they're not very supportive. So we've done fairly well with them, but we basically do better with our email splashes when we come out with those.
What is your top selling book right now?
We don't really have anything that really flips off the market. We're very lucky that we have a kind of an exclusive with these GA houses. So when the GA houses come in, we'll get 50 GA houses, of which 35 are already pre-sold. So we have customers for those that we resell to every time, and nobody else has them as quickly as we do. So Futagawa has been very good. So he'll come out with those on a Monday, and we'll have them that week, and some of the other people go through distributing, and we get them directly from him. So the GA houses are probably the most popular.
So you're coming up on almost 40 years in this location in a couple of years.
Yeah.
Will you have some sort of celebration? I guess my question is, what are your goals for the bookstore for the foreseeable future?
I don't really know. I'm trying to find. I'd be interested in finding somebody who could kind of take it over, because I'd like to somewhat retire. But I don't think there are too many people that would be interested. There are a couple people at this point in time we're talking to that might work. I've been very lucky here. I have a very good landlord, and they basically supported the bookstore. The rent hasn't been outlandish, and so they've been very supportive. They're as much a partner in the bookstore as I am.
This happens to be a very historic building that you're in, too, isn't it?
It's called the Sherman Building. It basically is called the Sherman Building because General William Tecumseh Sherman was one of the developers, and it was one of the original bank buildings, I believe, in San Francisco. And he was here in the 1840s and 50s. And I don't think the building ever worked. I think he may have gone bankrupt, and then he went back to become a general, and he became fairly famous as a general. I don't think he was very famous as a real estate. Yeah.
I want to switch away from the bookstore for a minute, mindful of your time, and get back to your art. So have you been continuously painting and sketching throughout the years?
Not painting. I have. I keep a sketchbook. I've also developed a series of sketchbooks that I sell, and they're basically paper sketchbooks, clear paper sketchbooks with vellum in the back for architects. So I use those. I don't. The paper isn't. I basically draw on a paper that's very very soft, and I've been doing these sketchbooks since '74. So I have, but I don't show the work. It's just a matter. It's more of a journal design sketchbook. So when I decided to practice architecture and not do painting, this was a way for me to keep involved in art.
Are the sketches then primarily of an architectural nature?
No, not at all.
Are they abstract?
They're abstract sketches of whatever I do.
Was there ever an overlap in your art and your architecture where?
Not really. I wouldn't say I sketch that well in terms of architectural sketches. The drawings are more abstract. I grew up, as I mentioned earlier, in Idaho, and that's when the abstract expressionism in America became quite popular. So when I was painting, it was really painting in oil and black and white images on large format. And so the sketches that I do now are more diagrammatic, maybe you would call them. But I have between 80 and 150 sketchbooks I've done in that period of time.
And weren't they just purchased or donated, I'm not sure, to a collection?
I think so. We haven't actually talked about that, supposedly.
The Eames Institute.
Yeah, the Eames Institute. Yeah. So
Petaluma, right?
They bought my libraries. So the libraries will be going to them, and they'll be then opening them up for use, and that will be coordinated with their institute, which will also include industrial design and the creative endeavors of the Eames. And at this point in time, they've just rented space next to me in my Richmond warehouse, so we'll be making that transition with that.
Where do you like to do your sketching? Do you do it while you're here in the bookstore? Or?
No, I never do it while I'm working. I usually do it at home or traveling. So it's also, they're sketchbooks, but it's also a diary. So I also have a complete diary of the bookstores from '74 on in those sketchbooks, but I've never really edited them because they're a little inconsistent on, I might go for 3 or 4 months and not do anything. But no, it's pretty interesting looking at them. I have tried to photograph them, and I have maybe 20 or 30 of the sketchbooks documented, and it's kind of interesting to see how you go through different developments in terms of maybe the sketches being black and white or pencil or adding color and so on. And occasionally I've done a few sketchbooks where I just deal with the idea of line.
Let me now switch a little bit to just the neighborhood and some of your personal life, if you don't mind.
Sure.
You're married. You got married in '86, and you've been living in North Beach really your whole adult life, haven't you?
Well,
on Telegraph Hill.
I've lived here since I would say I moved to North Beach in '74, or '73 actually, and I lived in Cow Hollow. I lived over on Green Street for 6 or 7 years, and then lived in Buena Vista Park area for a couple of years. Then I had a studio down on Pier 33, art studio. But yeah, I've lived in San Francisco since I would say probably '69, and I moved to the area in '66, '67. Yeah.
So do you feel like the neighborhood is kind of a big part of who you are? Are you involved in the neighborhood?
Not really. I'm not much of a social being. So I'm an observer. And
I think of your store as kind of a real cultural touchstone for this.
If I hadn't have started the store, I wouldn't be in San Francisco now, I don't believe. I would have moved years ago. But you just don't pick up 50,000 books and move it somewhere. But the location in San Francisco has been good to me. And I like the area of San Francisco. It's just kind of a small town in a way, and it doesn't it's not big enough to. It's never been big enough to make my shop work. So I've always depended on outside sales to make it work. So I've located here because that's where I was at the time when we started it, and it's been fairly good. And I would say the architectural activity probably in the 70s and 80s was very exciting, but then it kind of went from privatization to commercial to institutionalization, and when it became institutionalized, it lost all of its interest. And those people have either gone or died, or the institutions have usually killed the creative juices that were brought about by the other interesting people.
Do you or your wife, Paulette, have any children?
No. It's no. We don't have children.
Or other family members in the area?
We have. We just met yesterday. Actually, we have a niece and her husband and a small daughter that live in. They live in Albany now. Other than that, Paulette's parents live in the Boston area, and all her parents have passed away. But she has sisters in Cambridge and a sister in Eugene.
Are you in touch still with any of your siblings?
My family's basically just a few cousins, but my parents have died. My younger brother has passed away, so there's not much. And most of everybody, the family, the immediate family was from South Dakota, and most everyone has moved from there. So there's only a few people left there, and I don't have too much interest in.
Have you been back to visit?
Yeah, I've been back. My brother died 2 or 3 years ago, and I went back there to finish up business there. But other than that, my mother lived there, and so when my mother passed away, we gave her house to my aunt, and my aunt is there, and she lives in this little town in the Badlands.
Are you still playing golf?
Played golf yesterday, yeah. Try to play 2 or 3 times a week. We play up in El Cerrito. It's called the Berkeley Country Club now, but it used to be called Mira Vista. But it was started in 100 years, so it's just 100 years old. And I should be walking, but I don't. So I've been riding the last year because I have a set of bad knees. But up until then, we tried to walk all the time. Paulette, my wife, she walks, so. It was, I'm not into hiking, and Paulette's into hiking and going into the forest and stuff, so golf was the closest thing that we both could work on that we liked. So.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground. Is there anything that we haven't touched on that you think we should?
I think this is most of it. We're just... probably find a few things that we'll forget, but I think we've touched on everything. I don't know if the sequences are all together, but at least I think we've hit everything once or twice.
There's a lot of things, a lot of moving parts, but we'll figure it all out. Well, I want to thank you so much, Bill, for taking time to do this interview.
Good. Well, thank you. I
I
appreciate
hope
you
you've enjoyed
putting
the
together
experience.
putting it all together.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thanks. That was good. Thank you.
Yeah.